Hi, I'm Cici. Thanks for having me. Many research indicate that immigrant households have a lower home ownership rate than the natives. 2016 Canadian census data show that there was a 6 percentage point home ownership gap between the native-born and immigrant. Using a multivariate decomposition model, this study decomposed this gap into a 69% difference in characteristic attributable gap and a 31% difference in coefficient attributable gap. Within the 69% gap, the differences in the following three characteristics accounted for the majority of this gap. Compared to natives, immigrants have lower average household income. Immigrants are more heavily concentrated in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And more immigrants have foreign degrees. To close the home ownership gap, policy interventions are needed to equalize the distribution of characteristics and to support home ownership among immigrants. Therefore, implications for the national housing strategy are as follows. First, provide income tax credit to immigrant first-time home buyer. Eligible applicants could claim to get back their income tax to use toward a down payment. Second, the Canadian government could adopt a similar program in the UK to help immigrants who are not in a full-time job to pay their mortgage interest or provide low-interest mortgage. Such program is helpful during and after COVID, when many immigrants have hard time to secure a full-time job. Third, offer housing incentives to attract immigrants to settle outside MTV. Lastly, the government of New Zealand requires people selling a house about less than 2 years to pay income tax. Such policy could be adopted in MTV, where the competition between first-time buyers and investors are increased. This tax revenue could be used to subsidize home ownership among immigrants in MTV. Thanks for listening.
Okay, so our first question for CC is from Tammy.
Okay. Thank you, Cici. This is a really interesting project that you have going on. I think we're all very aware that there's no single immigrant experience in Canada, right? People enter very different ways as students in economic class with their families and also as refugees. And so one of the things that strikes me to be very important in that conversation to think about various people as immigrants is how intergenerational transfers play a role in being able to make that down payment or have that first home. So I'm just wondering if you can speak to the influence of intergenerational transfers in characterizing these differences across Canadians.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think you are definitely right that immigrant is not a homogeneous group. For this research, I'm just look at the aggregated differences between immigrant and native-born. But to investigate the difference among immigrants across different groups is my next study. So I think in terms of intergeneration transfer, I think I didn't include this in my model because of data limitations. I think the effect of such omitted variable are reflected in the 31%, the unexplained part. So such omitted variables could be such as immigrant preference. How about some group of immigrants, they just don't want to be homeowners, or wealth accumulation. This is speak to what you just said, the generational transfer and discrimination. So I think for further, because in this study, those omitted variables are not measured. So I cannot say whether policy intervention is needed or what kind of policy is needed. So I think for further research, it would be better to look into this 31% unexplained percent and to include more data. I think the Canadian Housing Statistics Program currently link existing data source on housing. That will be a great data source to look into in the future to further dig into the 31% unexplained part. And also, I think it could be better to include IMDb data in the housing statistic program, since we know that it has many immigrant-specific variables, such as wealth accumulation, like what you said, general money transfer. So then we can get a more specific idea around those kind of omitted variables that I'm not included in my model.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Claudia.
Thanks for your study. Really interesting. So my recollection was that you selected immigrants who came after 1980. Was that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, good. The memory is serving me well. Okay. Kind of a similar question. So in having, been involved in some studies looking at immigration trends, we know that there are different waves of immigrants that come at different times, often from different countries. So they, depending on the year, they often represent different source countries. So similar question is, did you adjust or control or look at even differences depending on whether or not they came 20 years ago or 10 years ago? Because again, that helps to capture either preferences or just differences in terms of the immigration population.
I think, unfortunately, I didn't include us in this study because, as I said before, I'm looking the aggregate differences between immigrant and the native born. However, that's been my priority for my next study. I'm going to look at how the differences among immigrants across different arrival cohort. So that means they may for different immigrant cohort, they may show different socio-economic characteristics, and they may have different housing preference. Like for some groups, they may have strong norms around housing tenure, while for others, more younger generations, they may rather invest their money in human capital, like their education, especially their children's education. So, or across different arrival cohort, they may have different preference in housing types, size, and locations. So those are the priorities for my next study. And then after I look into this, I can come up with tailored housing policy to meet specific need across different arrival cohort.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right, Hugh, you know the drill.
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed reading all of them, but I enjoyed reading yours as well. I have a question for you. So it seems from your recommendations and your implications to policy, a lot of what you put forward costs money to Canadians, be it some sort of tax credit or something along that lines. Well, could you spell out the benefit to the ordinary taxpayers, as citizens, already citizens of Canada, what the benefit is of higher home ownership within immigrant communities?
Yeah, I think it has huge benefit for the neighborhood, since high home ownership rate are associated with social capital growth and neighborhood stabilities. And also linked to, I think is Fernando, over panelist in yesterday's presentation. He mentioned that community amendment is really important to trust building. So I think by having a higher home ownership, it will contribute to build a community trust and a neighborhood stability, and also promote a higher social participation to the entire community. People are more willing to invest time and money to build their community. So I think this this could be this could have a lot of benefit for the neighborhood in general.
Thank you.
All right, Umit.
Great. I think the problem you're pointing at is very important, especially these days with all the housing prices skyrocketing and everybody's worried about immigrant, non-immigrant. So that's a given for sure. You got probably many policymakers' attention with this type of a focus. And between, I think Tammy and Hugh probably, they stole my questions, but I'll state them anyway in a slightly different way maybe. But the first one is obviously, different immigrant groups, how do they differ in terms of housing ownership patterns, if you will. You already spoke to some of the factors. Obviously, you already know probably, but the census 2016, but even 2011, you may not know, already has been linked with immigration categories. So, and Dan Hibbert, you may know maybe that name, UBC geographer. He's done already some studies on refugee home ownership in Vancouver area, and he came up with some very high rates, near Canadian-born home ownership rates of housing ownership. So that is possible to look at by immigration category, and I hope that you do pursue that line. The second one is kind of a little bit related to that, is the, as you do your study, and obviously there is a direct link to housing policies, as Hugh was pointing at, and also in your response, you already started pointing at another kind of a policy domain, which is actually immigrant, refugee, settlement and resettlement, integration policies, So let me ask that, actually, based on your study here, do you see, does your study, or how does it speak not only to housing policies, but also to immigrant newcomer, let's call it, settlement, resettlement, and longer-term integration policies? Do you see the relevance?
Yes, of course. Since as many researchers suggest that international immigrants who are international students previously, they have higher economic and social outcomes. I think my finding further prove this point. Also, because more immigrants have foreign degrees, this contribute a lot to the home ownership gap. So I think admit more international students will further close the gap. So the government should provide easier pathways for international students to transit from international students into permanent residence. I think we already make changes since in the past. The most common way for international students to transit is through PNP, provincial nominee programs. However, it takes time, and the PNP allocation is limited. So I think recently we already removed some of the restrictions to admit more international students. However, I think that is not enough, because let's say if I graduated from University of Windsor, after I graduation, many of them immediately moved to Toronto. So I think the retention is the key issue for the whole story. So I think the policy should focus on how to retain international students in the city where they are studied, like in Windsor. And then after they're graduated, they can contribute to that city. So I think for settlement policy, for immigration or settlement policies, they could provide more job more internship or co-op opportunities, and provide easier pathways for international students to transit from inter-student to full-time employee after they graduated. So that kind of help with the retention rate. Also, I think I want to mention a little bit about this, because in my research, I find foreign degree do impact home ownership, but we don't know through what kind of mechanism do foreign degree affect home ownership. It could be through income, through language proficiency, discrimination, or just because those international students who studied in Canada are more familiar with the home purchasing process. So I think for further research, it could be look more detail into those mechanisms, and then we can come up more specific settlement services. For example, if we identify it is because language proficiency, then the settlement services should provide housing policy, housing information and services in more languages. Or if we identify it's only because those international students, they studied in Canada, and then they are more familiar with the process, so then we can offer the settlement services could offer housing information, home ownership education courses, like what the U.S. government did for the newcomers.
So just any of the other judges, open floor for you all. Tammy?
A policy challenge came to mind as you're speaking. So, in Kitchener-Waterloo, where I am, we see that a large part of the housing demand that's driving an increase in prices, it appears to be at least partly driven by international students. And we're always trying to attract more international students here. Many of them are buying a first home in Canada to live in as a condominium, for instance. So in thinking about the different policies you were talking about, if you had a policy that prevented someone or tried to disincentivize quick sales of their home, say within 2 years, how do you see that influencing the experience of that student, especially when we want to think about trying to retain them in the region? Just wondering if you could speak to that.
Oh, sorry, I don't quite understand your question. So for international students, if they want to return, if we want to return them in the region, they will not sell their house within 2 or 5 years. So that's not speak to those international students. I think my policy is only speak to those residential property investors who just buy the house and want to make a profit from it, who sell it less than 2 years and then make a profit. I think that we should tax on that kind of profit. I'm not sure, is that what you're asking?
Well, I'm just wondering, so I realize that's who you have in mind. I'm not sure if you can differentiate between those folks who are just trying to flip houses and make a profit and the international student who moves into a student neighborhood in a condo and buys the condo, but then when they're done their degree, they might want to move to a different neighborhood, right? Within a fairly short period of time. It's hard to, policy-wise, I think it's hard to make that distinction and write it down into law, even though we might want to.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. So what I'm thinking is, how about making the difference between how many houses, how many properties you own. So if you are a multiple homeowner, then you will be taxed. Be taxed if you sell it. But if you are only on one home and then you sell it, then this law is doesn't apply to you. So does that make sense?
That does. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, judges, anything else from you? Umit?
Just a quick one. It's not a question, but I was very pleased to hear that somebody knows about IMDb, which is very good news. Thank you.
Thank you. I love that data set. So I like to see the Canadian Housing Statistics Program linked to IMDb. So I'm going to use it for my future research.
Well, this is good. So, Cece, I think there's a lot hiding in your foreign credential variable there. I wonder if you could speak to how foreign credentials are recognized in Canada and maybe kind of just hypothesize about what role that might be playing in your result.
Sorry. Yes. I think foreign credentials are less recognizable in Canada, especially in those large traditional immigrant destinations, because they have a large talent pool. Employers can choose their desired employees from a large talent pool. Then they don't want to recruit those with foreign degrees, since they don't know that. First reason is they don't familiar with that credential. They don't know how it equivalent to the Canadian credentials, or they are discriminated against those who immigrant who comes from other countries. But in rural part areas like the Atlantic Canada, it has a pilot program, and it attracts immigrants to resettle in Atlantic Canada. And there is a research, I kind of forgot who is the author, but there is a research shows that foreign credentials are less discriminated against in Atlantic Canada than in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. So immigrants with foreign credentials earn higher incomes than their counterpart in MTV. So I think employers are discriminated against those foreign credentials in especially in traditional immigration cities.
Okay, so you see it being less of a legal status of the credentials and more of a labor market discrimination story?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. All right, so thank you, Cece. That was